Thought leadership. It's become such a buzzword that it may have made you roll your eyes already, just 1 second into this episode. But before you click away, what if I told you the data shows that agencies who invest in thought leadership build an audience of potential clients who are more willing to follow, hire, stay with, and refer peers to those exact agencies. Susan Baier is the founder of Audience Audit, where they help agencies create thought leadership content based on quantitative research that builds trust with their potential clients. In today's conversation with Susan, you're going to hear the 3 specific elements you have to execute great thought leadership, what potential clients want and don't want to see in your content, how to discover your agency's point of view, the foundation to your thought leadership efforts through a process Susan calls the Rant. We also touch on some surprisingly easy ways you can get started with thought leadership content even without a large research project or a budget to go with it. Before we get into those, let's hear from Susan about an agency that first hesitated to invest in thought leadership, thinking they had quote-unquote nothing new to say, but they were soon surprised by the market reaction to the insights they started to share.
I have a client who started on their thought leadership journey a number of years ago with respect to doing a study and publishing a study. And I would be remiss if I said that a lot of that journey was easy for them. They struggled to decide that this was what they wanted to do. They had a lot of doubt and uncertainty around whether they actually could come up with something different and new, and went back time and again to the study and rethought it and sort of were really adapting to what they were seeing out there and going, well, ours isn't going to be good enough. If we don't make some changes, ours isn't going to be enough. And we finally did execute their study last year. They presented it at a major industry conference. It went over exceedingly well. When we got the results of the study, they were like, is this going to be enough? Is this different? Is this interesting?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I think it's going to be enough. And so that presentation was really well respected. After that, they got invited on industry podcasts to talk about it. There was a lot of buzz about some of the data that they'd found in their research. And I actually just saw them this year go to their industry's biggest conference, an international conference, in which not only were they presenting the research and participating in panel conversations about the research, but other presenters had incorporated what they'd found in their study into their own presentations, into making adding their own thought leadership based on what our client found in their thought leadership and had been sharing. And I was looking at their social, and one of the posts said, if I'd had $1 for every time I heard so-and-so got new information talking about their study, I'd be a rich man. And it is a journey. It's an investment. It requires a lot of self-trust. And it's not always easy to think that you have something that can be really different and helpful to other people. But I see so many folks, whether they're working with us or doing their own research on their own or using data they have from an assessment or some of those kinds of things. It's amazing to see for me the journey that people go on between thinking we're not special. We don't have anything that's special enough. We can't, this is so much work. How are we going to get this done? If we're doing everything else, to a journey of realization where their audience is saying to them, thank you for being helpful. We're sharing it with others. Other experts in that industry are talking about it too, and really coming to feel like, wow, we've contributed something that's really changed the conversation that we want our prospects and the people who are learning from us to be having.
Changing the conversation. I think that's such an important point. And in the story that you just shared, those are some of those qualitative things when thought leadership is done well. You can tell you're changing the conversation by those social mentions, by those other folks, maybe even competitors referencing your study and the thought leadership that you're putting out there, the research that you invested in at conferences and those sorts of things. The other word I wanted to key in on there, Susan, before we talk about some of the upsides and challenges of thought leadership, how to do them effectively, especially on a budget if you're a smaller agency.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to double down on the word that you mentioned there, trust.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, with Audience Audit, you guys do a lot of research. It's your
Mm-hmm.
specialty to run surveys, and that can turn into thought leadership.
Yep.
Why do you think that really data-based content that comes from research and studies rather than what I would say is pontificating that we especially
Mm-hmm.
see a lot on LinkedIn, why do you think that that is so important right now for the marketing mix? I'm thinking even more broadly, but especially for marketing agencies, that tie between the research and the thought leadership and the trust that you can build versus kind of the pontificating or just content marketing in general.
Yeah, I mean, another really good question. It's no secret that we are living in a time in our society when trust is really eroded in almost everything. If you've read the Edelman Trust Barometer, you know that trust is at its lowest ebb that they've seen in 15 or 20 years. And it's trust in pretty much everything. It's just fallen apart. And I think we've all had that experience, unfortunately, of being at a conference, being really excited about a session, going in, and really realizing that you're just being subjected to a 40-minute pitch. We did research a couple of years ago with B2B thought leadership followers, folks who were actively seeking out experts in their space, with predictive ROI, who are our friends and clients. And a shocking number, 73% of the people in that study who follow B2B thought leaders think most B2B is just bunk, that most of it is just pitching and ego and not of any value. And this is not even including the people who've just given up following anybody altogether. These are people who are sticking with it. But what they told us was that they've had to work really hard to find people that they trust to follow, people who have something new to share with them that they haven't seen before, something that is helpful strategically and tactically, and somebody basically that they trust, somebody who feels like them, somebody who's approachable, somebody who has experience in the business and is actively engaging in that on a day-to-day basis. It's like the bar is low and we're still not meeting it, most of us as thought leaders. It
The bar
doesn't
is
take
low and we're
the
still
bar is
not
low.
meeting it.
I know, and it doesn't take that much. And I think that one of the things that research gives thought leaders is something truly new to say. I know, new information, new perspective. It can really be done to provide helpful information. But one of my favorite things about it is this question of trust. A lot of our clients will go into a study thinking it's going to prove something right. And I tell my prospects, my job is actually to try to prove you wrong. I'm a researcher. So if you're still right, then we know you're really right. But there are often things, it's a box of chocolates. You don't exactly know what you're going to get. And there are often things that don't validate what you thought they would validate. And sometimes I'll have clients say, well, we don't want to talk about that. And I will say, please talk about that, because what we see with people who are really doing good thought leadership based on data, whatever kind of data that is, the best of them are admitting when it has surprised them, admitting that despite their 20 years in the industry or whatever, they're seeing something that they didn't expect, something that's new, something that they hadn't asked in a particular way before. And they're talking about how the model they've been using needs a little bit of an update, or they forgot, they really missed a whole perspective in an audience because of their own assumptions. And that builds trust. And I think that's why research-based thought leadership is so powerful. There's data you can rely on. And there's, in the best cases, there's perspective from someone who's willing to say, this isn't exactly what we've been teaching. We need to rethink that. And that, that builds trust.
And I think sharing, exploring, wondering, pondering about those things out loud, for instance, on social, as you were saying that, I'm like, that LinkedIn post writes itself. I've been consulting with manufacturing companies for 20 years, and I can't believe right? Yep. People are going to click see more on that post, right? Yep. And I think that the folks who are willing to do that, I think it goes back to something that you mentioned earlier. You've got to have some trust in yourself to be able to, look at this with unbiased eyes, do some research into the market that you serve, and then go out there and share it and put that out there into that market that you serve. it feels a little bit scary, but really it does put you in that position to establish trust when the bar is so low. And as you said, we're not even meeting it.
Yeah.
Your opening story, Susan, was a great example of the wins that can happen when a marketing agency or any sort of agency really invests in thought leadership. And before we get into the framework that you have, I'm excited to share with listeners today the three components of thought leadership that actually does generate ROI. What do you think are some of the upsides, as well as some of the existing challenges that are keeping people away from doing this sort of thought leadership, especially as an agency?
So I think number one is that sort of pervasive fear, call it imposter syndrome or whatever, that we really aren't that special, that we really don't have anything that somebody else hasn't said some way before, and that nobody's going to pay attention to us. But the best thought leaders out there really do want to help. And I think if we look at thought leadership differently, not as an opportunity to promote ourselves, but as an opportunity to help the people that we care about in being successful by sharing what we know and teaching how to do yourself what we do for our clients. Those things are at the core of really powerful thought leadership. And so I think if we could sort of get off the perspective of thinking we're just talking about ourselves all the time and we're not that great and people are going to laugh at us or say that we don't have anything to share that's of value. And we think about the people that we encounter every day in our work who come to us and say, can you talk to me about this? Can you help me with this? And then go, wow, thank you. I hadn't thought about that before. That's really helpful. Wow, that's an easy trick I hadn't realized. And if you think about people like that, you can go into thought leadership much less worried about how it's going to make you look and much more concerned about how helpful it's going to be to the people that you really care about. And quite honestly, if you don't care about the people you're talking to, you should get out of the game.
You're not really going to be that great at thought leadership. It's like the person who wants to claim visionary or thought leader in their LinkedIn headline. I just roll my eyes when I see that. I'm like, thought leader is not a title that you claim. It's something that is bestowed upon you.
That's right.
Right? Because you're actually helping. And something that you just brought to mind now, Susan, that I was thinking about earlier, and it kind of floated out of my mind, as can happen from time to time, is that really thought leadership, oftentimes, I say, especially in the last 5 years, people use it kind of swapping it out for just content marketing, right? But if we think about what thought leadership really is, it's identifying trends in the market and sharing your thoughts about those trends, about the bigger picture. If you've never read Andy Raskin's breakdown of Zora's quote unquote best sales deck ever, we'll link to that in the description. That is a great example of thought leadership through a strategic narrative. And it's not just thought leadership isn't just putting out content about your company, your product, or even the solution that you provide. It's bigger than that. It's the trends. And if you don't have data to back that up, how are you going to be able to speak to those trends and actually have people follow your thoughts somewhere, right?
Yeah.
It's bigger. It's about the landscape and the market as a whole, where you're actually putting out thoughts that can lead people somewhere. I think that maybe triggered a thought for you there.
I just think that, in our research, followers have been very clear about what they think true thought leadership is. Something new, something helpful from somebody I trust. And you can, new doesn't, it's great if it's data. I think that research gives thought leadership, gives it a level up in terms of its visibility, in terms of the trust that people place in it. We know that conference organizers love real data-based presentations because they know they're not getting a talking head or a pitch from the stage, those kinds of things. But the crux of thought leadership is having something new and helpful to say. And that new may just be a new perspective on something that's already happening out there. It may not actually be new data. It may be a new look. It may be a new synthesis of what's going on. New and helpful are the words of the day. And unfortunately, if we're out there sounding like everybody else and talking about what we sell, that's not new. And for most of the people seeing it, not helpful either. And that loses you points pretty quick.
Mhm.
So the thing I want people to think about with their thought leadership is, what do they have to say that is new and helpful to the people that they are trying to serve? And if you get
Absolutely.
those two right, you're on the right path, whether you've got a ton of data behind you or not.
Speaking of data, Susan, you guys are usually neck deep over at Audience Audit. What does some of the data show us about the impact of thought leadership, especially for agencies and professional service firms?
Surprisingly powerful. We did this study with Predictive a number of years ago, and specifically asked folks like the extent to which having a thought leadership relationship reputation on the part of a provider, the impact that would have on things like following their content and listening to them, recommending them to somebody else to follow, hiring them, staying with them. Extraordinary percentages, much higher. So in the 60%, say much more likely that they would actually pay attention to your content if you have a reputation as a thought leader, as an organization. More likely to hire you, more likely to stay with you, more likely to refer you to somebody else. It has a huge impact. And again, it's that trust and being helpful. Why wouldn't you follow? Why wouldn't you share? Why wouldn't you hire if the time was right for you? The person who's out there every day providing you helpful stuff that makes it easier for you to get your job done and gives you new ideas. And we see it in the data all the time. It's worth doing. People freak out. People are like, well, I don't, we've got our sales organization doing this, and we've got our ad buy doing this. And I'm not saying those are bad things, but for many people, this whole thought leadership thing just isn't happening. And what we see over time is that it can transform all of those other things and your need for them. I mean, we have clients who are doing no outbound selling at all anymore. All they're doing is their thought leadership, and right fit prospects are coming to them and filling their pipeline and allowing them to charge what they're actually worth because they are seen as different than their competition. So super valuable for sure.
Yeah. It's very interesting. It reminds me, last year we had Joe Sullivan from Gorilla 76 on the podcast, and they were talking about, 2023 was not a great year for a lot of agencies.
Nope.
And he was on talking about how they were dealing with managed growth when they were having too much demand for what they could actually onboard and staff up for the new client demand that was coming in. And as we dug into that, they had really invested in thought leadership. They had been doing a podcast for multiple years. They started another podcast for a different persona. They started a community, and doing these things over time, they had people, maybe the volume isn't up. Maybe it doesn't increase your MQLs by, 10x, but you're getting the leads that you are getting are converting at a much higher clip, at a much higher percentage. So I think
you can charge better rate.
Yes.
For that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I love the 4 that you broke down. People are more likely to follow, hire, stay, and refer. If you're impacting all portions of the business and the agency, then, this is something to pay attention to. So with all of that, as always, we want to give you tactical advice to be able to implement. We want to spend a lot of time on the how here on Agency Life. So Susan, let's speak to first your framework with the 3 components of thought leadership that actually make your efforts worth it and are generating these positive things that we've spent the last 10 minutes talking about.
Yeah, for sure. So, thought leadership is an investment that you are making, monetary, time, opportunity cost for other things you could be doing, whatever. And what we've seen with our clients and prospects and just sort of out there in the world is that if it's just a vanity project and you just want your face on Facebook all the time, go do that. But most of us are looking at thought leadership as an opportunity to build our return on investment for the activities that we're doing. And if you're not, as I said, that's fine. But for most of us, we're trading off time spent on thought leadership versus time spent on selling or prospecting or, doing client work or whatever else. So you really got to get a return on it. And the 3 things that have proven time and again to drive that return are differentiation, right? So you do have to be saying something different than everybody else. Visibility. People have to be able to see you saying whatever it is you're saying. And then conversion. You actually have to take that visibility and that reputation that you've developed and turn it into sales. Because if you don't, again, vanity project. And I don't think a lot of us have time for that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And I think that the differentiation is something that has already been part of the conversation here. So talk to us a little bit about this first one, differentiation. How do you get that right? And how could people get it wrong? And then we'll take the following two, in turn, visibility and conversion.
Yeah. So when you think about differentiation, I want you to think about it combined with helpfulness. Okay. You have to be helpfully different. So it doesn't help to be out there wearing funny clothes. That may not necessarily get you where you want to be. The differentiation I'm talking about is having something to say that not everybody else is saying or saying in the same way. So data can be really helpful in differentiating because a lot of the people out there don't have data. I worked with a gal over the last couple of months who reached out to me because she's a coach. And she has had an assessment going since like 2019. And she's got 3,000 responses to her assessment, which is about sort of living your values and all of that kind of thing. And it's just sitting there because she didn't know what to do with it. Well, she's got data. And now she's starting to talk about what that data actually says. So she can go buy that data. She generated it herself, but she's got something concrete to say, hey, look at this. And when I talk to folks about thought leadership content that's based on data, the formula that I'm always proposing to folks is, what does the data say? Number one, what do you think about that, given your perspective and your experience? What do you advise based on that? And if you can be different in that combination of things, find something to talk about it in a new way based on your experience and what you know, and provide advice. You've got differentiation and helpfulness all wrapped up. And if you've got actual research and statistically reliable data, even more so, because that will stand out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, going back to your comment earlier, the bar is so low. Oftentimes, it's not that you have to commission this giant study. If you start collecting something, even just kind of organically, like this coach with 3,000, still a substantial number. But I find that even if I put out something and say, hey, I've talked to 50 agency owners on the Agency Life podcast over the last year and a half, and I asked them this one question, and here's what they said, that elicits more of a trusted response and that differentiation and helpfulness of, someone's saying something that actually is put more thought to, other than I just logged on to LinkedIn and wanted to talk
That's
about
right.
something,
And your
right?
content, Logan, the reason it works so well is because you don't just share some data point that you got, hey, 42 people said this. You share your perspective on that and you share advice based on it. So there's that formula. I tell people the research that we do is not thought leadership. It's like the diving platform at the Olympics. It makes you look really impressive. It makes you look like you know what you're doing, gives you a lot to work with, but ultimately you are still the diver. So data is a great support for you to build thought leadership off of, to talk about the things you want to talk about and to share helpful information. But you still have to be the thought leader there. So just posting data quote isn't thought leadership. People really want to know. The reason people follow thought leaders is because they want to know what we think based on our expertise.
Yeah.
And so you got to have that as part of the element. And that's why your stuff works so well.
I love the way that you broke down. We're talking about the three, right? Differentiation, visibility, and conversion. And then the formula for differentiation has three parts. What does the data say? What do you think about it? And then what do you advise? And sometimes you can hold that advice with a little bit of an open palm. You don't have to necessarily come with this heavy-handed pointing at people. You should do this.
Nope.
Oftentimes, just saying, hey, here's what the data says. Here's what I think, actually elicits, especially on social, more conversation, more engagement, those sorts of things. So going back to that imposter syndrome, I just want to give people a few thoughts that maybe can quell that a little bit.
Totally. And you can say, I usually advise clients this about this topic, but I'd be really interested to know what you all think about that. When you encounter this with your clients or whatever, what do you tell them about this? How do you teach your team about this thing? So Yeah, vulnerability is great. None of us are as smart as we think we are.
I know I definitely am not. And
Me
I am
neither.
with you there. I think, especially on social, where a lot of this thought leadership content distribution is happening, that I think vulnerability is actually more of a superpower than people would initially think, or even think, even if they've been doing a lot of thinking around this. I just said think like 3 times. So we
That's
need to
okay.
move on.
All good.
So differentiation, I love the diver analogy.
Mhm.
Data and research aren't thought leadership, but they are a platform that can help you then execute those 3 parts to the formula, or the 3 components to a successful dive.
Yep.
So let's talk about visibility. Where do you see maybe people get this right, get this wrong? Maybe they do some research, or they look at some of the data they have or their perspectives, and they're like, okay, we need to get this out here because I think this is so important. I've talked to people that are like, we have great thought leaders within our 4 walls, digitally, of course.
Mhm.
And I'm like, do you?
Mhm.
Does anyone
Does
seen their
anybody know?
thoughts? Right? You might have SMEs, you might have great thinkers, but it doesn't mean that they're thought leaders. So to me, this visibility piece as part number 2 really is where that transition starts to happen.
It's so important. And this is where so many of us fall down. So the first thing I will see is people holding, if they do have research or some special insight, holding it here and saying, well, if you get a meeting with us, we'll share some with you. Okay, that's not thought leadership. That's a sales tactic, because thought leadership by definition is to be shared. You want it to help people. And if you're only using it to try to bait people into a sales conversation, it's not going to go well. Okay. So if you've got something to share, share it. Trust me when I say that it will come back to you in multiples. So don't be afraid to share what you have. Um, a lot of folks are hold on to stuff because they think it makes them look like they have a niche, and they don't want people to know, because they're afraid that a niche will limit their opportunities. So they're like, oh, well, this is just for our healthcare clients, and we don't really, that's not all we do. So we're just going to keep this, and we'll do a little thing with our clients about healthcare. Nope, nope, nope. If you have a niche, embrace it. If you don't have a niche, get a niche. But if you have one and you're doing thought leadership in it, don't be afraid to show it, because what people respond to is seeing that you're investing in understanding something that's affecting them. And if you hide that light under the bushel, you're missing out on a huge opportunity. Third, organizations, and for some reason, I think agencies in particular struggle with this. They have not built relationships with others in that ecosystem who could help share their thought leadership for them. My dear friend Pamela Slam, amazing, has this wonderful book called The Widest Net. And it is about building an ecosystem around your business. And if you have thought leadership and you want it to get shared, start building relationships with others who serve the same community that you do. Whether they do the same thing you do or not, they can be incredibly helpful in leveling up your thought leadership, adding their own. Look what happened to my client at that second conference. Other thought leaders talking about their thought leadership. So I don't think we invest enough in really thinking about who is out there trying to help the same people we're trying to help. And what would happen if I called them up and said, hey, we're thinking about doing some research. Would you like to participate with us in it? Would you be willing to send it to the people that you have in your community so that we can include their responses? Would you like to comment or be part of the content coming off of this research because you have a different perspective than we have? You do a different thing than we do, but we're all trying to help the same community. So I think that's a huge problem. And finally, the fourth problem is the biggest one, and it's just staying consistent and sharing what you've learned. It's really, this is where everybody gets tripped up, and I'm no different. You start a video series and then you sort of get bored and you forget one week and then you forget another week.
Yeah.
And before you know, it's been a year. Or
Yeah.
you put out, Drew McClellan and I are the worst offenders of this particular problem. We've been doing.
I was going to shout you guys out as great examples here, but you're going to share the other side of the coin.
We've been doing a research study together. This will be our 11th study for agencies, the Agency Edge. We've been doing it every year since 2014, I think was our first. I don't know. I can't do the math. So this is year 11. And for almost all of those years, we did the research. We did a white paper report. We sent it out. We did a webinar to go over the results, and we said, see you next year. And, I have to admit, with the studies that we do for ourselves, for our thought leadership, it's difficult. Sometimes you're like, whew, at least that's off my plate. Now I can go back to getting my regular work done. But thought leadership requires consistency. It doesn't mean you can't be human, right? And get sick or go on vacation. But it does mean that, as we said, Logan, going back to your word, it's an investment. So you have to treat it like an investment. You have to treat it with care, which means that you're planning your thought leadership strategy. You're not just sitting down every week going, what are we going to talk about this week? You actually have a strategy for what you're talking about by quarter, by month, by week, whatever. You've got topics figured out. You're batching your content so that for your followers, it's consistent and they can start to rely on it. And that's incredibly powerful. So most of us are flubbing on one or more of these 4 things, and I'm no different. But it's tricky, and you've got to make a commitment to doing it.
I think the list that you keep just dropping here, Susan, I love when people just either give mental models or a visual framework or a list or step-by-step guide that can help with something that often feels kind of ambiguous and fuzzy. And I think thought leadership is definitely there. And here again, with visibility, the second of the 3 components, you broke it down into these 4 common problems. 1, don't heavily gate the thought leadership content. If you go to teamwork.com/agencylife, where you can find these episodes and other stuff, like we have registration pages for our webinars, because that's how you execute webinars, right? But we're not gating the podcast episode pages, right? That someone could find on Apple Podcasts or YouTube anyway. So I'm totally with you there. The second piece in sharing it even beyond who you think it's for reminds me of Nick Bennett from Harness and Hone, who was on a previous episode of the show. He's like, you'll be surprised that when you start talking about the problem and the data that you see and the trends out there, that you will attract people that aren't necessarily from your niche, but they have the same problem. And those, back to your earlier point of attracting the right people who are going to convert at a higher rate, that contributes to that as well. We'll link to that one, that episode with Nick Bennett in the episode description here as well. Number 3 is not thinking about who else could share it. And I'm a big believer, I've heard it kind of described this way, is we're going from the how economy to the who economy. And it has to do with that trust factor that we mentioned at the top of the episode. It used to be 10, 15 years ago, as the information age really exploded, we go to Google, how do I solve this problem? Now we know that we could get pages and pages and pages, even though we only stick to first page of Google and usually first 1, 2, 3 results. But more often, because of that limited trust that we have everywhere, we're first asking, who do I know that I can trust to tell me how to solve this problem? So you're still trying to figure out the how, but you're going to the who first. So I think your example there of building out the network and the relationships in your space, which is why I'm thankful. Even on this show, we've got folks like you who've contributed to the podcast and the webinar, doing collaborations with Drew McClellan. AMI doesn't do the same thing for agencies that teamwork.com does, but we're trying to reach the same people, help the same people, right? Other people like Marcel Petipa at Parakeeto and Gray McKenzie at ZenPilot. So I see that as having been effective for us here. So I'm a big believer in number 3. And then number 4, the consistency piece. I look at people maybe in B2B marketing to call people out, because I think a lot of marketing agencies will recognize the name Chris Walker. I heard him say, I've been one of the most consistent people on video in B2B marketing for the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm like, he doesn't do a lot of highly polished video, but you know what he does? His way of collecting market insights started during the pandemic when he was hosting a webinar that was mostly Q&A, just marketers asking him questions, him responding. He built a system to chop those up into short form video, to write content that goes with it. And he's been able to produce bite-sized thought leadership content that comes from kind of a different sort of research that's more live Q&A style. So I think all 4 of those are just so vastly important. The third piece of thought leadership that actually drives ROI is conversion. And oftentimes people think about this and they're like, wait a second, thought leadership is quote unquote top of funnel. So why do I need to be thinking about conversion when it comes to thought leadership?
Well, if you're going to generate a return of investment on it, you got to think about conversion. It is true that you will have people reach out to you who you never even knew were following you, who say, oh, I've been following your stuff for a year and we're finally ready for a project. Let's go. But there are far more people who are in that sort of funnel where you are being helpful, you are being vulnerable, you're building their trust. They're seeing you interact with others who serve their community and have a good reputation. You're sort of, this is all boiling. And then you're also saying, hey, this is how we do this particular thing. You could do it too. Here's the details. Here's exactly how we go through this. I'll never forget Jay Baier, like probably 12 years ago when he first started Convince and Convert, did this post about how he made his videos, like the equipment. He had an equipment list. He showed you how he set up his lights. He did all the stuff. That wasn't what he did for a job. It was just people. He had so many people ask him, and his videos were so awesome that he published this thing, and it was huge, and it was trust building, and it was vulnerable. And there are still folk doing that kind of thing. So one of the things that makes people a little uncomfortable sometimes, getting to the point where you're actually giving them something for free. It's not everything you do, but you're giving them a clue about how they can move along this path by themselves. So for example, I can help somebody learn how to look at their data and analyze it in a particular way. I can teach somebody about statistical significance so that when they're working with their own data, right? You're not giving away the farm, but you are being helpful. There will come a point at which they are ready for more help, either because they can't do it themselves or they did it themselves, but they need the next thing, which they don't think they can themselves, or an ancillary thing. You've got to have a way to build an addressable audience. If you want to continue to get deeper in being helpful and talking to them and nurturing people so they go, well, we're ready to do research. I don't even think we need to look at anybody else except for Audience Audit. That's where you want to be. So it's fine to gate some resources so that you get an addressable audience, you get an email address. In our studies with our clients, a lot of them will have the visualization of the data that's available for free. And then if you want to download the 30-page report that they spend a tremendous amount of time synthesizing and designing and pulling together, then you get an email for that. But then you can't turn around and turn into someone they don't recognize by saying, hey, thanks for downloading our thing. Here's our course for $4,000. Sign up today, because you've lost. Trust is hard to gain and can lose it in a minute.
Yeah.
So you have to take those addressable audience members and continue the conversation with them. Be more helpful, be whatever. And that's what starts to ensure that you have an actual predictable pipeline of prospects that you're inviting to events or whatever, because there's this sort of big nebulous, we don't know who's listening, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is we know who's listening.
Right.
And then there's nurture opportunities that you can do without looking like an asshole and trying to sell them stuff that just continue the conversation and build that trust further. And so that conversion thing is really important. And the trick to conversion with thought leadership is you have to have something that's worth them giving you their email address.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants to give that away. It has to be worth it. So if you have a big research study or report, maybe that's worth it for some folks. If you're just synthesizing a bunch of information and you build we're working on a research now, on a resource now that's just called What We've Learned, that accumulates all of this research and data that we've done into thought leadership for people to be able to download. It's just a synthesis of all of this stuff that we know. So you can do it with research or without research, but you have to have something that's worth it for them to give you their contact information. And then you have to treat it with respect.
Yeah, you definitely have to treat it with respect. You don't want to turn around. And it reminds me when you were saying trust is hard to gain, easy to lose. The one-liner I love about that is trust is gained in droplets and lost in buckets.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of drops to fill up that bucket, but you can dump that out very, very quickly if, to use your words, Susan, you become someone they don't recognize if they've been following you for 3 months. And then they give you your email because you offer something of value, whether it's signing up for a free cohort or a free course or some sort of lead magnet, that sort of thing. But you need to continue the way that you've operated publicly. You need to continue to operate one-on-one or, to scale a little bit to that now owned and known audience. So I completely agree with you there, Susan.
Yeah, my friends at Predictive call it a screaming cool value exchange. And I think the important element there is exchange. It's a
Hmm.
value exchange.
Yeah.
And we have to think about them as giving us something in return for something that makes it worthwhile to them, not to us, to them.
Yeah, exactly. So as we round out the conversation, Susan, I want to spend a little bit talking about advice for agencies to kind of use your model. We've been talking about what does some of the data
Hmm.
say around thought leadership. We've been talking about, what we think that means, right?
Hmm.
And now to use your own formula, I want to give you the mic to talk a little bit about some of your advice, especially for agencies who are hearing this. They're starting to percolate some ideas. I think we've kind of teased those a little bit. What are some of the different ways in which you think that they could get started, especially if they're getting started, early, maybe
Yep.
without research, with and without? Talk us through some of those.
So we have a lot of prospects who come to us saying they want to do thought leadership, but I'll say, do you have a point of view? And they'll say, not sure.
What do you
I'm not
mean?
sure if we do or not. It's a common problem. I will tell you, almost all of them do. They just haven't thought about it in this way. A great way to unlock that is the rant. I am a huge fan of the rant. So basically, get your team together and get people talking about stuff that really pisses them off when they see it. People that, things that their prospects are being sold that are no good, things that people are telling their prospects that are not accurate, things that just really make you crazy and want to strangle somebody when it comes to your prospects, something they think or something that people trying to sell them stuff are trying to say to them that you don't think is right. And man, will you get a ton of information about your agency's point of view. Don't do this, do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't
I
do
I
this, do that.
love some of those questions, and I've used them before in my own content as well to try and tease out a point of view, say for a podcast guest. I think you could
Hmm.
do the same, turning internally to those SMEs that you want to become thought
Yes.
leaders, or just pull the thought leadership out of your agency. Ask some of those questions like, Susan, I might ask you, Susan, what's a commonly held belief around thought leadership that you passionately disagree with? Right? Or Susan, what is something that you see people doing as it relates to thought leadership that you think they should stop doing?
Right.
Right? Or
Yep.
the inverse of that. What's one thing you wish people would start doing?
Right.
And those sorts of things can cue what you call the rant. I
The rant.
love that
And
naming.
it's such a good, the vehicle you can use all the time. First of all, it feels great to just get it,
It's
right?
just cathartic, right?
Feels so good. But it also tells you what your agency believes to be right. And the best thought leadership, I would argue that all great thought leadership comes from a point of view. Okay? You are not, your job as a thought leader is not to distribute something no one can argue with. That is not your job. Your job is to teach and to help. And your point of view, based on your experience, your research, all of that kind of stuff, is core to making that helpful for the people that you want to serve. So if you don't know that your agency has a point of view, start ranting and develop one. Because the next thing that happens is once everybody's on board to like, this is our point of view, and you just say to people, send me stuff that you think violates our point of view. Send me articles, send me posts, send me stuff that you're like, nope, we as an agency would strongly disagree with this. That's a great basis for a content program.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
Start a channel on Slack that is just called Rant, or
Right.
Room to Rant or something like that, and have people drop those in there. And you even said it there that you strongly disagree with. I think I said passionately disagree
Mm-hmm.
in one of my prompting questions. So
Mm-hmm.
definitely speaking the same language here. So number one is find out if you have a point of view. And if you don't, or you don't know what it is, use some of these tactics to uncover it or extract it from the founder and your team. What after they've kind of overcome that hurdle, Susan, what
Yep.
is the next step you're typically recommending?
I mean, you can decide whether you want to get research around this, whether you want to build an assessment that's asking visitors to your site about their experience with these various topics that are part of your rant, these various beliefs, whatever. But ultimately, you have to start creating something. And I think what's helpful is to sort of, once you've got your point of view together, try to sort of bubble up the main themes that you talk about. If you're a creative agency, you may be talking about different things than if you're a media agency or if you're a SEO shop. But you're going to have things you want to talk about. Maybe they're what's going on today, AI, privacy, first party data, like all of that kind of stuff. Maybe it's more foundational stuff. Maybe it's, like, I think everybody's doing this wrong and I don't understand why we're so stuck on this. But bubble up those themes and then assign a theme to each of 4 quarters for the next year. So come up with 4 themes that you want to talk about and give them each a quarter.
Yeah.
And then take each quarter, you're going to have like a big ranty post about, each quarter. And then each month, we're going to talk about one aspect of that in your posts, in your videos, in your podcast interviews with your guests, in your social content every week or every day, however you want to do it, right? Spread it down.
Yeah,
Disseminate it down. But then you know what the topic is for the quarter. And if some article comes out that says, hey, Elon Musk just released his AI code publicly, and everybody's talking about this in your industry, then you could just slot something in there that's consistent with what you're talking about for the month.
Yeah.
But it gives people a context so they learn what you teach. They learn what you talk about and what you care about. And that's a very easy way to organize a year of content around what's fundamentally come out of your rant as an agency.
Yeah. I love what you're saying there, because this concept of developing your point of view and then starting to create themes, whether you're using data or kind of anecdotal things that you're providing commentary on, which I think there's even power in just starting there.
Absolutely.
I mean, look at how many YouTube channels are just commentary, where they're just doing reaction videos and not even quote unquote original content, but it is original content because they're sharing, going back to your formula, what they see by sharing the original content, right? What they think about it, and then what they advise. It also helps with the consistency, so that you're kind of beating that same drum. And the thing I will recommend to folks, anyone listening to this who's thinking about thought leadership for their agency, and you're also a parent, how many times do you have to say something before it sinks in, right? Yep. You have to repeat it. You have to have these things that, I saw Justin Welsh post about this on LinkedIn just recently. He will reuse posts, not to just be a lazy content creator, but it is a little bit presumptuous of us to think that our entire audience saw and engaged with and remembers, even if they did see it, that post from earlier in the quarter. We have to be willing to repeat ourselves and come at it from different angles to really have that visibility that's going to lead to the conversion, going back to your 3 parts of the
Absolutely. Formula. And for different angles, think about who out there in the ecosystem is ranting about the same things you're ranting about, and get them to guest with you, get them to be your guest on a quarterly Q&A about this topic, interview them. There's so much good conversation that can come out of things that you think, but it may not be universal. And there's a lot of teaching and a lot of learning for us as thought leaders. If we're living in a box and never listening to anybody else, I don't think we're going to last very long as being helpful thought leaders. You got to learn from other folks, and conversations, disagreements, rants. Those are some of the most engaging types of content that there is.
Yep, absolutely. It's my friend Isaac Morehouse, who's the CMO at Reveal. He talks about this concept of living in market. If you want to have thoughts that are actually applicable, up to date, engaging, thought-provoking about the market that you serve, you have to be engaged in that market, in that network, right?
Yeah. And that's one of those core elements of that 3 things that they want. They want it from somebody who's actually working day to day in their business.
Yep. Couple of tips for folks. If you're not familiar with a tool called SparkToro, that is a great tool from, if you recognize the name Rand Fishkin in marketing, from his Whiteboard Fridays and a lot of the stuff he's done, content for marketers. The tool that he's now put out there, SparkToro, helps you find who are the influencers, who are the thought leaders, what are the YouTube channels, what are the podcasts in our specific niche that people are following, listening to, engaging with, all of that sort of stuff. So that can help with one of the things that Susan said earlier, is find those other ranters, find those other people who are having this conversation. Maybe you start reacting to their content. Maybe you start also inviting them onto your webinar series, your podcast, ask them to do a quick Q&A and do a LinkedIn Live, those sorts of things. Another thing I've done, I wanted to call out you and Drew McClellan at AMI as great examples of doing data-based research that can lead to thought leadership. Pete Caputa from DataBox, who's been a guest on the show as well, is a great example. And he's talking a lot about how to do this with other people in the ecosystem, those fellow ranters, as we are talking about here. And one thing I've done is I've recognized you, Susan, Drew, Pete, and others who are sharing content and thought leadership in the market that we serve here at teamwork.com, agencies and professional service firms. And I'll simply go to LinkedIn and I'll hit the bell notification instead of just following or connecting with those folks, even if I'm already connected with them. So I get a notification every time that they post so that I can go and chime in. And it does a couple of things. One, I'm doing the learning that you're talking about. Two, I can start to engage in the conversation, which one might create some visibility for me and my company just by commenting. But also it builds a relationship with that other thought leader where if I say, hey, Pete, do you want to come on our webinar series? He's like, oh yeah, you've been commenting on my posts for the last 3 months,
great.
Those sorts of things.
It builds them up. It supports them. We should be helping each other. The folks out there who are really generously providing help and guidance to the people that we care about deserve our support. So posting, commenting on their posts, sharing their posts, engaging in the conversations is good for all of us. And it can really give great people visibility that they might not have without sort of the people that are following us knowing about them. It's really good. It's a no-lose situation.
Yes, absolutely. Well, as we recap, we've got differentiation, visibility, and conversion. And I think if you're following that framework or that list that Susan laid out, what does the data say? What do you think about it? And what do you advise? If you think about that, then it will actually lead to conversion because you want to be helpful, as Susan was talking about. But if you're just being generally helpful and you're not saying, this is what I recommend, then people don't know what problem you solve, when to come to you, when to think of your agency. And so that also comes into why niching down and focusing on a problem and a specific market and who you serve it for leads to more profitable agencies, as you and I and Pete and others have talked about on this show and in other places as we engage in that conversation around agency operations here within this ecosystem. Well, Susan, I could talk about this all freaking day with
Me
you,
too,
but
brother.
this has been fantastic. We're just getting a little more ranty as we go
I know.
on.
It inevitably happens.
I love it. Well, I want to make sure we have time for our final two segments that we always do, our Fast Five and our Good Shout. So we're going to transition to our rapid fire round. And my first question for you, Susan, is, if someone gave you an extra $10,000 a month, no strings attached, to help better run your agency at Audience Audit, where do you think you would use those extra budget dollars?
I would use them for expertise, for gaining more. I would use them for learning because I think learning passes through us to the people we're trying to help.
Yeah.
So conferences, engagements, working with people who are smarter than I am at stuff I need to be able to do and then can share with other folks. That's where I'd spend it.
I love it. All right. Number two, what are some of your all-time favorite books, especially those that you recommend to other agency founders?
So I already mentioned The Widest Net by Pam Slim, which I love. She's got another book called The Body of Work, which is incredible in sort of thinking about how unique you really are and how your experience plays into that and how you can utilize that as you move forward in your business. Very, very powerful. I love a book called Die Empty. And it's really about being generous and thoughtful and giving everything you have away if you can. That has been very inspiring to me. Gosh, there's so many books. This is a weird one, but actually I have it here on my desk.
This show. I love it.
So this is a little book called People Aren't Robots by Annie Pettit. And she's extraordinarily brilliant. And if you are asking questions of anyone, this book will tell you how to do it right, whether it's a survey or an assessment or an interview or something. It's like, how do you really ask questions that people want to answer and get answers that are not biased and any of those kinds of things. So just a little
I really like those all four of those, the widest net, the body of work, die empty,
Hmm.
people aren't robots. I think the body of work and people aren't robots especially are applicable to this conversation
For sure.
today. If you want to generate that engagement that we were just talking about a few minutes ago, you need to ask the right questions. So
It's so
that could
true.
be a resource that can help you there. The body of work, I've never heard of that one or read that book,
Mm.
but I imagine that the other area that we didn't even spend a ton of time on in this conversation, especially for agencies, is thought leadership around their methodology, around
Hmm.
their own IP that they develop out of that methodology, which is based on research and maybe not even quote unquote typical research, but kind of cataloging what you've done with clients and what results have happened. So I
Yeah.
think that book probably is going to help along
It's
those
so
lines as
it's
well.
so good, I think, for any leader to really
Yeah,
sort of understand what you have to work with that you might not have thought about in your own self.
I love it. Well, we are making our fast five not so fast, which is on me as usual. But number 3 is my favorite. Susan, what's one mistake you've made in running your agency at Audience Audit that you're never going to forget?
I've taken my eye off the numbers. Our good friend Drew McClellan, he
Hmm.
and I have been together for a really long time. I've sat in many of his workshops where he's taught about agency math. And I've been able to get by for a while, not paying too much attention. 2023 was a devastating year for agencies. Most of our clients are agencies, so you can imagine the impact on us. Um, and it taught me that no matter what else you're doing, you've got to keep an eye on the agency math, or we're at risk, and there won't be anything you can do about it. So
Yeah.
luckily, a lot of we survived 2023. A lot of our clients and prospects survived 2023, but it was a nail biter of a year. So we are reinforcing here our focus on running our agency by the numbers, which ultimately will allow us to do the work that we really love to do,
Hmm.
helping our clients and our prospects and our followers. So an important thing to remember.
I love it. We're going to get to the hardest and the best part of agency life, but to slow down yet again. Sorry, folks. I try to keep the fast five quick, but what you just said there, Susan, reminded me. We did a webinar last year with Drew McClellan from Agency Management Institute. If you're not following him, get on his newsletter. Great stuff there. But he really did a lot of that agency math, breaking down how to set realistic goals and then backing into, okay, then if we need this, what does churn need to look like? What does new business need to look like? And walking through and making things very, very simple. So grab a pen and paper after you finish this conversation with Susan and I. Check out that webinar linked in the show description here with Drew McClellan. It was a great one. All right. So to speed things up, Susan, I'm going to give you the last two just in tandem.
Okay.
Number 4, what do you think is the hardest part about agency life? And number 5, what do you think is the best part about agency life on the other side of the coin?
I think the hardest part about agency life is much like the hardest part about owning any business and running every business. I love agencies, always have, but running a business is hard and you have to make hard choices. And that makes for long days, and difficult conversations. The best part of agency life, I love agency people. I started when I first started Audience Audit, I lost my last agency job during the height of the recession, couldn't afford to go to a conference that was happening nearby for small to mid-size agencies. So I just sat at the bar and opened a tab and started buying drinks for folks. And I tell people now that I built my business on a bar tab. I continue to do that. But for me, I love being in a position where I can teach, and I love the people that I get to work with, who are agency folks who overwhelmingly are very smart, really know what they can do to help, and are really trying desperately to
Hmm.
do that and to keep
Yeah.
up with a market that is just changing transformatively every 6 months or so.
Every
So
6 seconds, it
so
sounds
so
like.
much change, so much pressure,
Mhm.
but really are still, I believe, overwhelmingly trying to fight the good fight and help the people that we're here for. So, gotta love agencies.
Absolutely. Built my business on a bar tab. I love that line. And I've never heard that story, so I'm glad that you shared that with me and the audience today, Susan. All right, final couple questions. Who do you want to thank or mention that you want to give a shout out to today that's impacted your own journey in agency life, Susan?
So I've already mentioned him, but I will give a shout out to Jay Baier, who got drunk with me in an airport cocktail lounge when our flight was late, then hired me to work with him at an agency here in Tempe, Arizona, and then has inspired me ever since with his creativity, his innovation, and his what I consider to be just the world's greatest thought leadership around the things he chooses, whether that's marketing or tequila.
I love it. Great spot to round out the conversation, Susan. If anybody listening to this is not yet connected with you or Audience Audit, what's the best way for them to reach out and stay connected?
Susan at audienceaudit.com. You can go to the site. I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook, trying to be very consistent.
Back to the theme of the show today.
That's right.
Well, Susan, thank you for another great conversation and being our guest on Agency Life today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Logan. It was so much fun. I'll talk with you anytime.